Good morning, everybody. It's nice to have you on this Wednesday morning. We're ready to kick off Plant Party. The Riparian Rendezvous is our theme for today, and we're really excited to have all of you with us. This plant party is hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M Extension Service, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Funding for the program is provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Megan Clayton, professor and an extension range specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. My co-hosts are Tim Sigmund, with the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Charles Kneiper, State Resource Conservationist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We have 22 wonderful door prizes we'll be giving away today. I'd like to thank our sponsors: Bammert Seed, Bear Crop Science, Native American Seed, Pogue Agri Partners, Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas Brigades, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these neat prizes. Let's go ahead and get some housekeeping out of the way. We'll be moving very quickly through 5 presentations today. Please feel free to type your answers into the question and answer box, the Q&A box you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them privately to you through there. We'll be sharing a link of the recorded webinar as soon as possible, but not the actual presentation, so be sure to take your own notes as we go along.
Thanks, Megan, for the introduction. So with that, we'll introduce our first speaker. Our first presenter today is going to be Kyle Wright. Kyle's a state water quality specialist on the ecological science staff at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Texas State Office in Temple. Kyle has his bachelor's and master's degree from Angelo State University. He has 20 years of work experience in the private sector, as well as 20 years of federal service with the NRCS. Kyle spent much of his life in West Texas and now resides in Salado, Texas. Kyle's presentation today is Healthy Riparian Area Management. Thanks for kicking off our plant party, Kyle, and good to see you. You can take it away when ready.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. Let me get my slides up here and we'll get started. Okay, good to go. Good morning, everybody. Dadgum, after that music, I hope I can keep the pep up and keep things going, but I'm gonna jump right in here. I'm just gonna take a few moments of your time and just briefly discuss some of the basics, kind of lay the groundwork for other speakers today, talking about healthy riparian areas, healthy streams, creeks, and why they're important to us. So we'll jump right into it. First up, what do we value about these areas? What do we value about a stream? Well, clean water, of course, that's going to be top of almost everybody's list. Clean water is extremely important to us, especially here in Texas. We need every bit that we can get. Fish and aquatic habitat, very important, especially if you're a fisherman. You want some good habitat in that creek and stream as well. If you're a guy like me who spent first half of my life in far west Texas, to me, it's the beauty of these creeks and streams. That is highly important to me, and I think it is to a lot of people as well. These are pretty places. We like to go, we like to watch and look. If you're like the grandkids in the photo here on this slide, the recreation, that's going to be top of your game. That's going to be highly important to you. And a lot of people like to play in these creeks and streams. Good wildlife habitat is also important, especially for hunters. You know, some good heavy cover is really good for deer. If you're a rancher, the abundant forage, grasses and different things in these areas along the banks of creeks and streams is going to be highly important. I know from my time in West Texas, a lot of times on a ranch, if you're lucky enough to have a creek or stream run through it, that's going to be some of your best grazing. And then, of course, a reliable water source, more and more important every day as more people tend to migrate to our state and want to congregate in these areas, we need a good, reliable source of water. So you might ask, what are the functions of a stream? And some of these are pretty straightforward and kind of like a, well, yeah, duh type answer, but some of these you may not have thought about as much. Of course, you know, the most obvious is a stream or creek is transporting water. It's moving water down the slope. But the one that you may not think about as much is another function of the stream is it also transports and deposits sediment. And this is just one of the functions of it. It's something that they do. Sometimes sedimentation can cause problems, but it is a natural form of what a creek or stream does. And of course, the last one, providing food, shelter, and other biological functions for fish and wildlife, also a very important function of a stream. Now, what about the riparian area that borders these creeks and streams? They have functions as well. First on the list there, you'll see a dissipate stream energy. These areas, heavily vegetated, thick growth, as we get into the heavy rainfalls and flood type events, this water comes out of the banks, moves out into these areas. And if you're like me, you've noticed and you fully understand that once it comes out on those areas, when it's healthy, it slows way down. So it dissipates some of that energy. Healthy riparian area can reduce erosion. It'll help to trap sediments. A lot of sediments get caught in these grasses when we get into those type of events. These areas also work to store water, and they'll retain floodwaters at times. You know, it spreads out, it holds that water, it allows it to go down slowly, and helps with our flash flood type issues and concerns that we have. These can help to recharge groundwater. As some of this water soaks into the banks, it tends to go into the aquifer, and also the last one on the list, provide some base flow for times when we're in drier conditions, which let's face it, I mean, a lot of our time in Texas is in those drier conditions. So healthy riparian areas improve water quality, and I'm just going to touch on these just briefly on a couple of points. Being a water quality guy, these are important to me. The soils in a riparian area, when it's healthy, they act like a sponge. You may have experienced this. I've seen it numerous times. After a rain, you're down in the river bottom or the creek bottom, walking around, and you can feel the ground give below your feet. It's just like a sponge. It has swelled up, it's holding water. And the good thing about that is then as it's holding that water, it's filtering it. Some of it will filter down deep into the aquifers. More of it will filter back into the stream slowly as it drains out of the soils. And so this is an important function of a healthy riparian area. The other we talked about was dissipating energy, and the second point there, floodwaters, as they spread out over the riparian area and out into these floodplains, the velocities go way down. You've all been on the edge of a creek or stream when we're having a flood event, and that water out in the middle of the channel out there is moving and moving fast. But the water at your feet, where it's up out of the floodplain and right where you're standing by the banks, is barely moving. As these velocities slow down, as it tends to slow things down, the great benefit of that is it allows some of these contaminants, sediment, nutrients, possible other pollutants, it allows them, as the water slows down, to settle down to into the riparian area and soak in, and keeps our streams clean. Okay, moving right along, you know, the dissipating the flood energy and the reducing erosion. The vegetation and trees, extremely important in these areas to help with that dissipating that flood energy. You know, we have to be careful that we allow these to develop and get thick, because when you start removing a bunch of that vegetation and trees from that area, you don't have anything to slow that water down. And as we talked about, that slow water is important because it allows infiltration. You know, the other thing too is that all the vegetation along those banks is serving a key purpose of helping to stabilize those banks as well. All that root mass down in the ground is going to hold that soil together. You know, you've got some cover over the top that's reducing the energy and slowing that water down, and you're can have a good positive result on reduction of bank erosion in these healthy systems. Okay, moving right along, some of the hindrances to a healthy stream. These are all different things that, if we're not careful, can cause a hindrance. Any kind of land disturbance down in the riparian area has the potential to cause a disturbance. If we're building down there, you know, I live in Salado, and we like to build and make golf courses and everything else along the banks of our creek, and it definitely is a hindrance to that healthy system. But anything that you do there can cause a problem. Even simple things such as the way we install crossings or bridges can have issues. Clearing down there can be a problem as well. Excessive concentrations of animals. This is an issue, and unfortunately, agriculture tends to get dinged on this quite a bit. In that a lot of times people will say that we just have too much livestock along the banks of the creeks and streams. And in some instances we do, in others not so much. But if it's excessive, it can be a problem. But notice I didn't say just livestock, I said animals. Because the other big problem that we have here in Texas and pretty well all across the South is feral hogs. If they're excessive in these areas, they will be a hindrance to the health of that area. You know, any animal, even heavy excessive deer concentrations, can cause problems with the health of the riparian area and the health of the vegetation. So we just need to be mindful of how many animals are on the area. Artificial manipulations, third on my list there, also key and important. If somebody comes in and we decide due to flood or some other reason that we want to straighten that stream out, get that water moved down. Definitely going to be a hindrance to a healthy area. Levees, dikes, anything like that. We want to dam up a section. We're gonna make some changes and cause a hindrance to that area that's healthy. Excessive traffic. This can be a problem as well. Of course, you can only imagine. You know, four-wheel drives, four-wheelers, dirt bikes, you can only guess the damage that they can cause in these areas. But it's not just vehicular type traffic. There are certain park instances across the state where the human traffic through that area in recreational areas can be excessive and cause hindrances to the health of that area. Woody removal, you know, removing trees, and other woody from the area. If you're removing too much, it can be a hindrance as well. And I like to leave as much of it as I can. And then final on the list there is excessive withdrawals. Anytime we're pulling water out, whether we're pumping directly out of the creek or stream, or whether we're pumping out of shallow wells that are in those alluvial aquifers that are fed by the creeks and streams, we can cause issues and problems, and that can be a hindrance to a healthy stream. So moving on to my next thought here, this is kind of an interesting topic, the dynamics of a stable stream. And there's a lot of truth to this statement, even though dynamic means it's moving and stable means it's not, in the simplest terms. But even in a stable situation, a creek or stream is going to have some dynamics at play. And so that's why I put the first statement on here that some lateral migration and erosion in a stream does not mean that it's unstable. These are naturally occurring things that in moderation are just part of the natural thing of a stable stream. These are dynamic systems, as I said, and a change in one variable will cause an adjustment in another. We see this quite a bit. Unfortunately, it's happening quite a bit in Texas, especially here where I'm located at in the I-35 corridor. As we have development and building in the watershed, we end up with increased runoff and increased flow in our creeks and streams. The variable that's changed is the runoff, and the variable that's adjusting is our creeks and streams change over time to handle this increased runoff. So, you know, the takeaway from this is that if we have one change, it's going to affect something else. And the other thing is that the stream, the floodplain, the riparian area, and the upland, this is all interconnected. It's all tied together, and effects in any of that area will have an effect in our riparian and in our stream. So some of the things that we should consider and pay attention to when we're working in these areas, as I said, these things will change. First, when changes are made in the watershed or stream, the stream's going to adjust. It's going to take care of it. It's going to do the best that it can to adjust and handle the new condition. Basically, anything that we do in the riparian or the stream is going to cause a change in the dynamics of that stream. And we need to be prepared for that. And we need to have thought about it and try to moderate as much as we can any impacts that we're having, any negative impacts. Because of that, just use caution when you're planning any type of conservation practice in the riparian area. Make sure that you've thoroughly researched it, reviewed it, and have a pretty good idea of what the outcomes will be from it before you actually work with a producer to install these conservation practices in a riparian area. And okay, I'm kind of coming down to the end, but I got a couple of key points that I want to make for you guys. And I took this slide here. I wanted to talk just briefly about soil health. You know, healthy soils are important. And honestly, some of the healthiest soils on our property are in the riparian areas. So we need to do things to help maintain that and improve it in areas that it doesn't, because like this slide says, healthy soils are important. It's the foundation that we're building of everything else upon. And I don't know about you guys, but I want a good foundation to install my practices on, and I think it's highly important. So just keep the health of the soil in mind. And the last item I've got on my list is that these areas are critical. These areas are special, these riparian areas. And from a water quality standpoint, to me, it's highly important from the standpoint that it's our last line of defense for clean water. These are the areas, these are our last chance to catch different contaminants, to trap debris, to hold sediments, nutrients, and other pollutants before they enter the stream. So we need to do the best that we can to conserve these areas and maintain these areas and take care of them. And with that, guys, I hope that kind of laid the groundwork for others to move forward, and that's all I've got. So thank y'all.
Thanks for that presentation, Kyle. You've got a couple of questions waiting for you there in the question and answer box. If you'd like to address those down there right next to the chat. If you all have questions for Kyle, please put them there. And again, as we move on through this, we appreciate Kyle's presentation there, but we're going to go on to Dan Caudle, who is a retired rangeland management specialist with 40 years with the SCS and NRCS. And Dan still remains active in range management as an independent consultant, both for individuals and state and federal agencies. So with that, his title of his presentation today is To Graze or Not to Graze? That is the question. So we'll pass this on to Dan and you can take it away.
Let's give this a try. I'm a newbie to this webinar.
All right.
Let me give it a try here. Well, thank you. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me to your party on the prairie here, or the riverside, I mean. I'm used to being in the prairie. Thank you very much for the invitation. When we talk about riparian areas in Texas, we have to include grazing lands in those discussions, because most of our riparian areas run directly through grazing lands as they wind their way toward the Gulf of Mexico. So the question now is, who is responsible for the management of these riparian areas? And of course, the answer has to be the rancher or the landowner who owns those lands. Went a little fast there. Let me get back. Okay, so there are two schools of thought when we're talking about how you manage riparian areas. The rancher, of course, says it's an integral part of my operation, so I have to be able to graze these areas. I can't afford not to ignore them and not utilize the resources there. The other school of thought is those who think that cattle should never be allowed to graze on these areas and they should be permanently excluded to maintain the integrity of our riparian, these special places. So to graze or not to graze, that is the question we need to consider talking about riparian areas in Texas. So let's think about it. These riparian areas are really complex landscapes. They provide us with a wealth of really exceptional resources. They occur as a network of integrated and interconnected ecosystems that form a patchwork of specialized habitats out there that are homes to diverse communities of plants and animals. And usually these riparian areas, even though they make up generally less than 5% of any one ranching operation, they provide an inordinate amount of the forage production, the biodiversity, and the habitat elements that exist on any given place. So they require some special consideration and preferential treatment on our lands. Let's talk about the complex issues that come along with these complex landscapes. First of all, I don't know of any other type of land that's as susceptible to off-site influences as our riparian areas are. Whatever conditions and activities that occur upstream, and I'm not just talking about your neighbor upstream, I'm talking about miles and miles and miles upstream. Whatever conditions and activities occur up there have a tremendous impact on the riparian area that runs through any given ranching operation. And the rancher has little, if any, control over what those susceptibilities are. So the riparian areas that run through your place is very vulnerable to frequent and reoccurring disturbances, the main one of which, of course, is flooding and the debris deposits that flooding brings with it from who knows where and who knows what's in it. So human activity upstream, whether that's through new housing developments and construction, parking lots, wastewater treatment facilities, petrochemical plants, whatever it is, your riparian areas through your place are very vulnerable to what comes downstream. But the good news is that these riparian areas are very resilient. As Kyle said, most of them have very favorable soil conditions. All of them have favorable hydrologic conditions. And because of the generosity of your upstream neighbors, there's always a presence of nutrients and sediments that come down the river or the creek onto your place, and you are fortunate recipients of those, as well as the plants and plant materials and seeds that your neighbor so generously provides to you. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not so good, but it's something you have to live with. But the biggest complex issue on our riparian areas for a rancher is how in the world do you maintain the functionality and the connectivity of that riparian system and still maintain the viability and the economic soundness of your ranch? And are these conflicting goals? Well, a lot of people really think they are, and they can be, but they don't have to be. They can be compatible and complementary to each other if and only if the rancher or the landowner includes as one of their primary management objectives how to maintain or enhance the riparian condition on their operation. And the greatest challenge when you're talking about implementing a sustainable grazing land enterprise on a riparian zone is how in the world do you reduce the concentration of grazing and animal use of that area, especially when it's most vulnerable. And so a little bit different take on how you go about planning strategies for grazing in riparian areas. The three most critical factors you have to consider are grazing distribution, the season and or timing of the grazing that you do on that area, and the amount of residual vegetation that's left after the grazing period's over. Let's talk about the distribution problems a little bit. Wildlife, livestock, and humans are just naturally attracted to riparian areas. They're pretty, there's a lot of water, there's usually an abundance of high quality forage and vegetation. There's usually some shade down there, so in the summertime you can get under those trees and cool off a bit. In the wintertime, those same trees provide a windbreak from the cool, damp, windy season in the fall and winter. So again, because of the concentration of grazing and loafing in riparian areas, you have to pay special attention to them and implement careful management practices to prevent damage not only to the vegetation and the stream banks, but to the streams themselves. And as with most operations, stocking rate reduction may not be the way to solve the problem, because you can be understocked and still be overgrazed. And a lot of times the kind and class of livestock that you run on a riparian area can be a factor. And cow and calf pairs are notorious for loafing around and hanging around riparian areas. So what do? Well, let's try to mediate or mitigate the situation a little bit by trying to attract some of the livestock off-site, at least for a little while, to give those riparian streams a break. And there's a couple of no-brainers that you do that on the upland areas. Provide alternate water sources located in different parts of the pasture or the area to try to draw them away, at least from a little while, from the creek or the river itself. You can move salt and minerals and supplemental feed and haying areas around and try to attract animals that way. Those are no-brainers, but we do anyway. But here are a few little crazy things outside the box you might want to consider, and they might not be applicable at all to your place, but they could have some application if you think about them and apply them in the right way. How about building some shade structures and putting them on skids so you can pull them around on your tractor behind your pickup to different areas, off-site, away from the water, furthest part of the pasture, away from the stream, and put them close to some little areas that you might just want to fertilize some of that native vegetation, just to give it a little extra kick, a little more nutrition, palatability. Maybe that'll draw the cows away for a little while. Or you might want to burn some small patches of vegetation just to provide a little fresh forage. Or you might want to establish think of it as a food plot for a cow. Some little small areas of palatable forages, maybe some annuals that you might want to put in an area that needs a little help. Maybe you got some bare ground there that could stand some vegetative cover. And that might help draw the cows away from the spring for a little while anyway. And then the seasonal considerations are very important when you're talking about riparian areas, because of the conditions that occur during those seasons. First of all, the summertime is a horrible time for cows to be grazing in the riparian area because of their tendency to seek out the shade and the water and just hang around there and trample. So when you're going to graze them in the summer, you have to be especially vigilant to where they are and how long they've been there and what the situation is. In the springtime, Great time for new growth, good nutritious growth, but because of that, you have to be careful on your grazing, not to let them overuse it, because if you overuse your forages in the spring, that pretty well cooks your goose for the rest of the growing season, because your grass won't be able to respond as well as it should if you overdo it in the springtime. Also, the spring usually have wet conditions, and those are critical times because of potential stream bank degradation by cattle moving up and down the stream bank, and soil compaction, where you have the wet soils and trampling causing compaction of the soil. So in the fall, your growth cycle is nearly complete, not quite as nutritious or palatable. So generally speaking, your grazing areas during the fall, grazing time in the fall, you have less impact on your vegetation. But a caveat here is, because you're grazing late in the season, unless you're careful, when the grazing period's over, you have less time for that vegetation to recover and respond before winter dormancy sets in. And of course, during the winter, you already have dormant vegetation. So cattle get really easy to manipulate in the wintertime. They'll follow a feed bucket just about anywhere. So they're easy to move away from the riparian areas with a little strategic planting and placement of supplemental feed and hay. But a caveat again here in the wintertime is that following grazing in winter, you have absolutely no regrowth occurring of your primary warm season forages. So you got to be careful to leave enough residual vegetation. And as Kyle said, this residual vegetation plays a key role, in fact, the most critical role in maintaining a properly functioning riparian ecosystem. They stabilize the stream banks and channels, slow that water down, hold it on the land longer, help it percolate and move laterally through the system, and filter and release the moving water, trap and collect sediments, pollutants, and debris, help you maintain a productive forage species out there, and increase your shelter and habitat values for other wildlife and animals. So let's talk about some grazing strategies. First of all, you have to be flexible and you have to make timely decisions. You got to identify the objectives for each riparian area on the ranch. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to riparian areas. Inventory the resources, determine the optimal season and timing to graze each specific riparian area. Manage the livestock distribution, limit the frequency of grazing, limit the duration of grazing, manage the intensity of grazing, and then monitor, evaluate, and repeat, because grazing management is not a one-time operation. It's a dynamic process that just goes through once and once and repeats itself over and over. The conditions are always changing. Again, when you come to grazing management strategy of riparian areas, don't forget that the management of the associated uplands is essential to how you manage your riparian areas. If you're a good manager of your upland areas, chances are you're going to be an excellent manager, a good manager of your riparian areas. If you're a bad manager of your upland areas, I can guarantee you, you'll be a bad manager of your riparian areas. So you have to include all the resources you have, integrate the whole operation, management areas, riparian areas into the management of your overall operation, and don't try to manage them just as single, separate, isolated parts of the ranch. Remember, every ranch is different, every riparian area is different, and every segment of that riparian area is different. So you got to tailor your grazing strategy to fit the situation, and like most things dealing with agriculture and livestock, there are no silver bullets and cookbook solutions. So my advice is to plan your grazing and riparian areas, make it a riparian pasture that includes both upland and riparian areas managed together to meet a specific objective. The area has to be large enough to be a manageable unit, not some long, narrow corridor which is impossible to maintain the fences on because of flooding and other situations. Make it a part of a flexible grazing rotation, or if you need to, a special use pasture that is used to alleviate pressure from other areas at specific times of the year. Remember that it's better to graze riparian areas with a larger number of cattle for a shorter period of time rather than leaving a few cattle in for a long time. We got to remember that there's substantial historical and scientific evidence that says grazing by large herbivores is an integral component of a healthy and properly functioning ecosystem. And any elimination of natural disturbance, including grazing, which is a natural disturbance, is itself a disturbance of the ecological processes that should have and historically did occur. And that can result in ecosystem instability and allow encroachment of undesirable plant species out there. And so your prescribed grazing can help you mimic these historical natural processes that occurred when the bison had free range to graze areas as they wish. So yes, overgrazing of riparian zones can negatively impact vegetation. It can cause erosion hazards, and it can produce unsustainable amounts of nutrients and fecal coliform. But remember, it's not the cow's fault. And as my good friend and rancher Meredith Ellis says, it's not the cow, it's the house. So with dedicated management and preferential treatment, ranchers can benefit from riparian forage and maintain good riparian condition. But remember that your success in doing so will be directly tied to the amount of time and effort you put into your grazing management. So remember, the goal is not permanent removal of livestock, and therefore to graze or not to graze, that really isn't the question. The question should be when to graze and how to graze. And with that, from the Pertinalis River, I say thanks, and I'll take questions through the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. And you actually already have some questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Tim.
All right, thanks, Megan. So next up, we have Matt Buckholz, a PhD student at Texas Tech University's Department of Natural Resources Management. He's here to speak to us about the impacts of whitetail and axis deer on riparian vegetative communities. Matt primarily studies multiple aspects of axis deer ecology in the region, specifically around junction, including population density, disease susceptibility, and genetics, but also has worked extensively with the large deer enclosures on the Texas Tech University Junction campus and others constructed on the South Llano River State Park and private properties along the South Llano River. This work has allowed Matt and other TTU researchers to assess the impacts of both axis deer and whitetail on the structure and composition of the vegetative communities in ecologically valuable riparian habitats, such as those along the South Llano River. I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. Just a second. I primarily study axis deer. I'm gonna talk about both whitetail and axis and what impacts they might have on the vegetative communities in the riparian zones, but primarily axis deer because it is what I study. So if I was asked to kind of give a little bit about some of the exclosures that we have on the Texas Tech University campus in Junction. So if you haven't been there or haven't seen them, few years ago, we built some rather large enclosures. There's 6 of them now on campus that are meant for long-term study of what kind of impacts are we going to see with axis deer and whitetail, and can we do some experimental techniques to see if we can alter and influence vegetative communities. So all 6 of these were built in the riparian zone specifically. If you've never seen it, this one in particular is rather impressive because it's 500 feet by 500 feet. It's one of the largest enclosures I've ever seen. These were originally built in February 2018. This one was built earlier. It's about 8 years earlier than that, so it has quite a bit of change. They were all wiped out by the flooding in 2018. If you remember that, when the Llano River flooded about 30 feet, the water line was roughly about this line, and then further to the west side of the river too. So all of these exposures were under about 20 feet of water at one point. They were then subsequently rebuilt in February 2019, and now we're looking at doing some very long-term studies. These are meant to be permanent on the campus, that we will see for decades kind of what impact both axis and whitetail are having. So first off, we need to look at what is the difference between axis and whitetail. What impacts are one species going to have, what's the other species going to have, and kind of the overlap, and to see, you know, if we would remove axis, okay, where can we potentially see some bounce back of certain certain riparian characteristics and where they're most having their impacts. So in the strictest sense of the term, axis deer and whitetail are not perfect competitors. They do not overlap perfectly. They do to some extent. Whitetail are what we would call a browser. They're going after the forbs, flowering plants, and woody trees, shrubs, other species. Axis deer are what we would term an intermediate feeder instead. They consume just about everything. So they do also go into the forbs and trees. But a large portion of their diet is grass. So if we get out of the very strict, perfect overlap competition, axis and whitetail do have some level of overlap, forbs and trees, and depending on certain years where we're seeing certain drought conditions, and availability of these different vegetative groups, we do have circumstances where axis and whitetail do eat all the forbs and trees out, get rid of all that browse, and when that happens, axis just switch their diet to grass. Whitetail can't digest grass in any significant amount, so they start having some very significant problems when we have years where the riparian zone doesn't necessarily provide as much as is needed to satisfy the requirements of both species. That being said, if you look at this figure, some of the other questions I get is, okay, if axis deer aren't perfectly competed with whitetail, are they competing with other things that we have on the landscape? And to some extent, yes. In cattle, not really. But if we start looking at sheep and goats, axis are a pretty good competitor with sheep and goats. And really, in terms of when axis are competing with whitetail for the available forbs and trees, and then kind of direct competition with sheep and goats, axis really are they're socially dominant to all these species. They're physically larger, they're more aggressive, so they actually push all these species off of high quality sites, and potentially impacting not only the right, vegetative communities, but also the species that are relying on those, not only wildlife, but also livestock. So if we look at Axis specifically, there hasn't been a whole lot of study on what specific vegetation species Axis consume. We know a little bit from some studies back in the 80s, but there really hasn't been like a true bite study or a true, what exactly are they eating. We have some rough ideas. So diet, like I said, diet consists of basically what is available. They eat anything. A large portion of it is grass, and especially at certain times of the year, particularly winter, when things like Texas winter grass is coming up. That is a large portion of their diet at that time of the year. They do go primarily quality over quantity, which is a pretty standard herbivore response. But that does play into certain things, like they will go for seed heads off grass that contain a lot of energy at that, when they're seeding out, versus some other species. So there could potentially be impacting the ability to seed. Some of the preferred species we do know from some of those studies back in the 80s, Texas wintergrass, buffalo grass, the grama species, blue stem species, a lot of our native species, which is when you consider that Axis are an introduced invasive species, when they start heavily impacting our native vegetation, that a lot of, some of the grasses here, the whitetail aren't really relying on, but we use them a lot for livestock. So if Axis are potentially impacting those particular species, it has a lot of impacts on livestock and some other things I'll go into later. So for example, this is one of our exposures. It was on a private property, a high fence hunting ranch, so controlled. No livestock present on the ranch. The only large herbivores are whitetail and Axis. So if we look at this, a bunch of this is Texas wintergrass. There's a ton of other grass species mixed in here. But if we look at the inside of the exclosure versus the inside is all seeded out about 18 to 24 inches tall. The grass outside, very few seed heads, about 3 to 6 inches tall. All of that impact, because we know there's no other livestock there, we know that grass impact is from Axis. So just in this, one snapshot, we can see a significant impact over what they have to biomass, and then we'll get into some of the other characteristics of ground cover and below ground cover that Axis impact. They will consume very unpalatable species if everything else is gone. There's no other source of food available. I have seen Axis consume, and then I've also found bite marks on common horehound. Common horehound has some nutritional value, but it is very unpalatable. So for Axis to go and eat that, but I've seen them eat thistle heads that are still rough and pointed. So that can't be very comfortable to eat. I've seen them strip mesquite through thorns. So they eat just about anything if needed to. So all that being said, what about Axis habitat? There's a very strong overlap with riparian habitats. With Axis, they need that water at least once per day, and also in India, where they're from, they are a riparian species. So just via their native biology and ecology, they are capable of having very significant impacts on these sensitive riparian habitats that both Kyle and Dan have talked about. They prefer grassland shrubland mix. so both they have that food source with available cover, but they also use bottomland forests and can have considerable impacts on those. And as one of our other components of my research, we've looked at estimating densities, and we did this for both whitetail and axis via spotlight surveys. So I can't give you the specifics here because the paper is actually in review right now. So once that is available, we hope to do another presentation with our collaborators at Hill Country Alliance. But comparably, whitetail and axis, whitetail density is only 16% higher than axis. They're roughly equal. And for axis that have only been here approximately 90 years now, to be roughly as abundant as our native species is concerning. There's a lot of reproductive biology that plays into axis that allowed them to grow, but it's very concerning that these two species are roughly equal. And once we combine these densities, you start looking at, what is the total density of deer and what really is the carrying capacity of the riparian habitats. And the combined density is exceptionally high for deer without having some significant ecological impacts. And if we just look at some of we did some estimates for habitat specifics, and really some of these names are kind of abstract. They're not overly important. But if you look at the riparian habitats, which, shrublands and barrens, mixed hardwood, mixed forest, grasslands, and wetlands, that covers the spectrum of habitat down there in the riparian zones. And the three highest estimated densities were all in those three. The upland habitats all had composed the five lowest. So just via how abundant they are, how dense they are in riparian habitats, axis can have significant impacts. And then we also know that whitetail are really dense in those areas too, because that's the best habitat. You start getting into the drier upland conditions, there's not as much available food for whitetail. These high densities of both species in the riparian zones can have some really significant impacts. So what really are those impacts? This was an exclosure that was on the state park in Junction, Southland River State Park. If you look outside the exclosure, which is in the foreground and inside's in the background, you can see that there is obviously quite the compositional change here. Outside is pretty much bare ground. Inside is a lot of grasses, forbs, and some other species. What is very interesting in this particular exclosure is we built this exclosure on purpose in a giant frostweed patch. There was nothing growing in that patch other than frostweed and horehound. That was the only, and then pecans as the tree structure. But that was the only ground cover was frostweed and horehound, neither of which are palatable. Once we excluded deer from this, we found a huge emergence of a ton of different grasses, which tells us that, within those monocultures of frostweed and horehound, there was actually a lot of seed in the seed bank in the soil of very valuable sources. So as soon as we excluded deer from being able to consume those newly sprouted grass species from as soon as they came up, we excluded deer. They were able to come back, and then they actually pushed out the non-palatable forbs. So by excluding deer here, we changed the composition of the community just by taking out deer, and primarily by removing axis, since they're the impacts on grass. So they do have significant impacts on those native grasses removal of those palatable and nutritionally valuable species that we use for livestock and for whitetail and other wildlife. But they also, like I said, they can drastically change the ground cover. This exposure, like I said, is one of the best examples for it. When you look at bare ground outside the exposure with a little bit of horehound down here, a little bit of frostweed spread in, and then you take out Axis and whitetail, and you get a big grass patch full of native grasses, high nutritionally valuable species. So they can have quite an impact just on the above ground cover and composition. Additionally, they are known, along with whitetail here, to prevent and slow regeneration of our large hardwoods. So we're specifically talking pecan and live oak here, a little bit of cedar elm and some other large hardwoods. But with pecan and live oak, in a lot of places where the two species are very dense, are very abundant, if you actually go and look for young seedlings and saplings of particularly pecan and live oak, you'll be very hard pressed to find them. And if you do find them, protect them, because they will get hit very, very quickly. As their first year basically into the growth here, they will get browsed on. And we've seen a shift where pretty much all of the pecans and live oaks that are left are just getting older, and we're not really getting regeneration of younger seedlings and saplings into the population, because our very high densities of Axis and whitetail are hitting those before they're ever allowed to grow. So some other examples I kind of wanted to show you. These are two other exposures. This is another on that first ranch that I talked about that doesn't have any livestock. This ranch rotates livestock on occasionally, but I don't believe there was any before this picture was taken. So in both cases, this really is only a year worth of change. And from when these pictures were taken, this fence was only up for a year. So there's considerably more biomass of particularly of grasses when we look inside the exclosures here versus outside. And there are additional impacts of trampling, and I'll go over that next. But Axis, because of the
we got about 30 seconds to a minute before we do.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. But if you see this, one of the other, I said those seed heads, if we take out Axis, these areas could be sources of seed for other native species that are being hit outside. So the last thing I kind of want to talk is Axis do have a considerable impacts on soil, erosion, and compaction via their trailing, removal of stabilizing plants, remove those large underground root structures. And kind of the last thing I'll leave you with is this video. I want you to pay attention to this guy right here. Pay attention to his nose. He'll do it here in a second. It's hard to see, but if you look at this right here, that is a clump of root that he just pulled out an entire clump of grass by the roots over through an exclosure fence. So not only are they impacting the above ground structure and composition, they are now impacting that below ground structure that Kyle mentioned earlier that are stabilizing riparian areas. So via their method of eating, they can have a significant impact on structure to both above and below ground. With that, since I'm out of time, If you have any questions, here's my email, but I will also be paying attention to the Q&A box for the rest of the presentations.
Thanks, Matt, for that great presentation. It really shows the impacts there of those exotic species on our riparian areas and competition with native species as well. Again, if you have follow-up questions for Matt, please address them in the Q&A box. He'll be following up on that. And Dan and Kyle, I think there's still a few questions in there for y'all as well, based on y'all's presentations. So with that, we're going to move right into Megan Dean, who's with Parks and Wildlife. Her presentation is titled Watershed and Riparian Ecology, the Science and Management Strategies Driving Watershed Conservation in the Chihuahuan Desert. Megan is a conservation ecologist with the Inland Fisheries Division of Parks and Wildlife. She received MS in biology from Texas State University in San Marcos, where she studied the native fish in the Rio Grande Basin. At TPWD, she works on the conservation, management, and research of native fish and aquatic habitats. Megan is currently the native fish coordinator for the Chihuahuan Desert region in Texas, in which she coordinates the planning, design, and implementation of habitat restoration, enhancement, and preservation projects in priority rivers and associated watersheds. She also conducts research projects, works collaboratively with the university and other research partners, provides technical guidance on conservation best management practices to landowners and local community partners to support healthy rivers, natural habitat conditions, sustainable native fish populations, and high-quality conservation-oriented recreational activities in Texas rivers. With that, Megan, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, like Tim mentioned, I work with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in the River Conservation Program, but I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Jeff Bennett, who is a conservation delivery specialist with the Rio Grande Joint Venture. I also wanted to quickly run through some of the partners that we've been working out in the Chihuahuan Desert alone. It takes a lot of different expertise and people and landowners weighing in. And I specifically wanted to mention the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who's been a huge funding source for some of the work that I'll be talking about in this presentation. And coincidentally, I've funded some of the work Matt was talking about. Those exclosures on the campus was funded through NIFWF as well. So they've been an incredible partner. So I wanted to kind of frame my talk in how I think about setting up restoration projects or conservation on a landscape. And I really like to think about it in a landscape watershed perspective. A lot of people don't understand what a watershed is. So I wanted to show this diagram so we could get all on the same page. And a watershed is a catchment basin for a river and system. So it contains those upland, riparian, and aquatic systems that we've been talking about in the last couple presentations. And it's really important to think on this landscape scale perspective, because whatever happens in the watershed, like in the uplands, does impact our riparian and stream components. So here, this is kind of like my visualization. So I think of working on a landscape scale from the headwaters all the way down to the coast and what kind of impacts they have. And I think like cross section across the landscape as well. So these upland habitats, which are seen with like the cattle or the deer on the right, into these riparian corridors into our aquatic systems. They're all very integrally tied, and it's important to consider these as connected systems. Let's see here. So I'm going to specifically be talking about the Chihuahuan Desert in West Texas, and there's a lot of things going on out there. A lot of questions I get are like, oh my gosh, there's fish or there's water out in the desert. And yeah, there's actually some really incredible riparian and aquatic resources out in this area. Not to say that they haven't been degraded or there's not issues, but there's a lot of really neat biodiversity and really special areas. If we look at some of our focal habitat areas for the inland fisheries, looking at riparian and aquatic system, it's the Pecos River, the Devil's River, the Davis Mountains in Texas, and along the Big Bend in Texas. And then the map on the right is showing the densities and locations of some of the really important grasslands. So the partnership that I have with the Rio Grande Joint Venture, NRCS, Sul Ross, Borderlands, we are looking at these priority conservation areas across this landscape to see where we can really focus our conservation efforts, staff time, funding resources, come together and really do some really neat projects to help benefit the landscape. So it's really important to start talking about these watershed conservation program projects by starting up in the uplands. And I love these really clear fence line contrasts, like the one shown in this photo of a West Texas rangeland system, because it really shows you how a grassland can be converted into a very different type of system, like the shrubland and brush encroachment we see at the creosote and mesquite. So just by changing the way people manage the landscape, you can have a dramatic impact on how that ecosystem functions into the future. That not only impacts, the grazing capacity, the utilization from humans for recreation, but the diversity and the wildlife that can utilize that habitat. So we've got to start in the uplands. Some of the issues we have seen in West Texas for the uplands are poor land management through different types of grazing, and it's not grazing in itself that is the issue, but the intensity and duration. And then development is also an issue in the area as far as changing habitat in the uplands. If we look at impacts to the riparian areas in these systems, it's pretty incredible to look at some of these old accounts of what West Texas used to look like, a bold and running stream studded with cottonwoods and alive with beaver. That changed really dramatically after mining operations moved into the area and mined a lot of that timber, which came specifically from those riparian areas because that's where the timber was located, and dramatically changed that landscape. Just to give you an idea of how much wood was pulled out by one of these mining operations, just for one mining company for a 3-year period, they purchased 2,522 cords of wood. And I can imagine cords of wood as, like a pile of wood, but what does that maybe kind of look like in terms that a little bit more easy for me to understand? That's almost 4 miles of wood stacked that are 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall. And that, again, that is just for 3 years for one mining operation. So again, with all the different competing mining operations out there, land use activities, the riparian galleries were pretty quickly removed from the landscape. Here's a picture of the Rio Grande inside the national park, and that top picture shows the river in 1945. It's specifically at Johnson's Ranch. And you can see that the river has a lot of different features in it that we look for as aquatic scientists. It has sandbars, it has riffles, runs, and eddy, these sandbars, point bar features, but the river also spans the entire width of that channel there. And then if you look down in 2008, that river has incised, so it's eroded and gone down in elevation. It's more disconnected from the floodplain, the steeper banks, and we've had a lot of invasive species like this giant cane and salt cedar invade the area as well. So that's a pretty dramatic shift in just 60 years. Here's another picture from the park showing one of the creeks that's pretty important out in that area. Just in the 1970s, you could drive across that creek and it was pretty well connected to the floodplain there. But if you drive over that same creek now, it's 20 feet below this bridge. They actually had to build a bridge over it because the stream had incised so much. So again, these shifts in how the landscape was managed has really impacted how these systems function through the uplands, riparian, and aquatic systems. So when we are looking at these highly impacted systems, we're kind of developing a plan of where to go and what to do. And we're taking a very fragmented riparian forest, if it's even present at all. There's a lack of riparian storage, that sponge that was talked about earlier. There's no connection to the floodplain, so we're having no storage capacity. There's a decreased ability for that riparian area and uplands to provide base flow for our creeks, so our creeks are drying. There's scour, because if you don't have your grasslands adequately vegetating the uplands, there's no infiltration. And once that water hits the ground, it flashes into the system and scours it out and exits very quickly. And we don't want that. We want it to slowly infiltrate into the ground and slowly move into both the aquifer and our streams and creeks to maintain a more consistent flow through our streams. So we're trying to address this broken hydrology with in-stream structures, riparian, and grassland management. And we're really trying to target areas where we can work across this landscape. So we're trying to do a grassland restoration project paired up with an immediately adjacent riparian project with an in-stream project, so we can have a really large impact in some of these areas. So how do we go about and we do that? So the most important thing I think we do is we go out and provide free technical guidance to landowners. And it's not just myself or Jeff, but we have a team of people who have a variety of different expertise and a knowledge about the landscape. And we provide this information to the landowner. So we sit down and talk about the historic use of the landscape or their ranch and how they're currently using it, how they want to use it, what kind of wildlife they want to manage for, how they want to manage their streams and riparian areas. And then we go on a tour and we walk around and say, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what we notice. If you tweak this or change this, this is the benefits that you can give to both yourself and your operation and our fish and wildlife populations across the state. So I'd say technical guidance is the most important thing that we do and is the first step in this whole restoration process. Here's an example of a grassland restoration project that Jeff took on in the national park. This is Tornado Flats, and it was heavily grazed by sheep and goat, especially towards the end of World War II. And you can see from this picture that there's no grass at all. And there's some shrubs in the creosote from the brush encroachment. And why is this necessarily a bad thing? So people go out to the desert and now they kind of just expect to see this kind of landscape. But when you do have the little rainfall that does fall out there, you really want it to be intercepted and to infiltrate into the groundwater. And you want to decrease erosion. So you see these gullies starting to form in the picture there. You don't want that because you're losing soil. So you're wanting to stabilize and promote that infiltration. So one of the things that they did were to create these mats and brush structures across the landscape to intercept that rainfall, which decreases the velocity as it runs across the landscape. And look at that pretty incredible transformation just by putting those brush structures in rows. The soil, when it has been completely degraded, compacts, so it forms like a hard pan, and that solar radiation is really tough on plants that are germinating. So providing that intercepting structure for the rainfall, a place for birds to perch and stuff, it's a really good combination to try to get grasslands restarted. Another tactic we take is by using spike, which is an airily broadcast chemical. And if you can see this before and after picture, it went from a creosote flat to a pretty impressive little grassland. And so there's different ways to kind of bring back those grasslands, but those are two examples of some of the techniques we've used lately. So moving from the uplands down more towards the riparian area, you'll often see a lot of these gully situations. This was a project that was tackled by the Dixon Water Foundation and Rio Grande Joint Venture this summer. They had a bunch of high school students come out and build these one rock structures or leaky dams in these eroding gullies. And if you can see just from one rain event on this top left picture right here, that was 6 or 7 inches of accumulation of sediment just from 1 or 2 rain events. So, you know, you're trying to stop the sediment and erosion before it hits our creeks, because once that sediment goes into our riparian areas, if it's even still remaining, it has a big impact on our aquatic habitats and if our fish can spawn or any different number of things. So we need to keep soil where it is and stabilize it. And this has been a really good tool to show landowners how to stabilize that soil in these eroding gullies. Another project that we've been really active in doing, and one of my favorite parts of riparian restoration, is the reforestation component. One of the issues that we've had is because of the mining operations in the area, there's very little trees that actually shade our streams anymore or help stabilize the banks or provide diversity of habitat for bird species and fish and all that kind of thing. And we've messed with the whole nutrient cycle of these streams and creeks. So by putting back in these riparian vegetations, we've primarily focused on 3 different willow species and cottonwood. We're starting to connect these corridors that are critical, especially in these desert systems. And so what we do is we go to existing willow and cottonwood plants, we cut poles from them in the wintertime when they're dormant, we soak them for the week, and then we actually sink these 6-foot poles about 4 feet into the ground to reach the water table. Then as you can see, it's starting to sprout from those nodes. And As you've heard earlier, these plants can be incredibly resilient, and they're doing really well. Because the area was mined so extensively, we are having difficulty finding source plants to bring to restoration sites. So we worked with the landowner in Presidio, Texas, to create a nursery for willow and cottonwood species. It's next to a wetland, so he had an available source of water on site, and we actually put in about 100 of these plants, again, both willow and cottonwood. And if you can see, we put in a PVC pole right next to it, which made it a little bit easier to irrigate. And the plants are doing really, really well. And we'll be able to use these plants specifically for restoration projects clear into the future. So every year, once they're established, you can harvest about 20–30% of the plant and not have any impact on it. So we held a nursery. We are building some spring exclosures. Springs are incredibly precious part of the landscape and the desert ecosystems. And specifically, this is a picture in Big Bend Ranch State Park, where there's a lot of issues with feral burros and trespass cattle that are really damaging these aquatic systems. So we've made a wildlife friendly fence. It's about 18–20 inches high off the ground to where wildlife can still pass through, but we're protecting these aquatic systems so the spring and the riparian area can recover passively and on their own. Moving further down into the actual part of the stream, this is a fairly new technique for the state of Texas, and we're putting in what's called beaver dam analog. So again, beaver used to be a really critical component to this system, and we don't really have them in these tributaries anymore. They're still located in the main stem of the Rio Grande, but these structures, which used to be part of these streams, are no longer there. So we're putting in these artificial beaver structures, and we're trying to capture that sediment and rebuild the bed of the stream to reconnect to that floodplain. So hopefully over time, this is a generational kind of project. Even though I'm excited to see these grow in, I want to go back in 30 or 40 years to see how they're working and what the landscape is changing. But we're trying to reconnect, again, the stream with the floodplain, so it's a little bit better hydraulically functioning system. We just had some very large rain events this summer, and this is how they functioned really beautifully. So a stream that had gone dry, that had water in it, not too long ago, was able to hold water for a couple of weeks, more easily reconnect to that floodplain, and that water was able to slowly seep into the system instead of to flash really quickly out, taking sediment and causing a lot of erosion with it. So it's been very successful so far. Then what's really important to forget, or to remember with these projects, especially as resource practitioners, is we want to keep visiting these sites and monitoring them over time to see how they're responding, what lessons learned we can take from these projects, and how to tweak them. It's an adaptive management process. We don't want to just do one prescriptive formula for everything riparian or in-stream habitat wise. We want to make sure we're going back and saying, well, this worked here or this didn't, and how can we make it better to improve these systems? So we have an ongoing project with the Rio Grande Joint Venture right now, where we're looking at how to monitor these projects and the best way to get the word out about them. Some resources I want everyone to check out is the Texas Riparian Association. They're a wonderful group that put on conferences and webinars and workshops that has been really important through the state. There's the Texas Waters, Exploring Water and Watersheds. And if you don't have a copy, please go get Your Remarkable Riparian. It's a wonderful resource. And then if you would like to read about some more work out in West Texas, if you look at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Landowner Incentive Program webpage, over on the left-hand side, you'll see a link to their bulletin. And they did a special West Texas bulletin, which has a lot of these restoration projects and monitoring that I think you guys will enjoy. And with that, I'm going to leave my contact information in case you have any questions, and I will hop on the chat to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Megan. That was really excellent. Great information. All right, we're going to run about 15 minutes over today, but stick with us because this last presentation that's starting, you do not want to miss. Dr. Ranclev is a specialist with mussels, and I guarantee you it's worth your time staying on here. All right, Tim.
All right, thanks, Megan. So we're ready to get our last presentation started. So you're in for a treat. Our final speaker, Dr. Charles Ranclev, is a research scientist at the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute. serving as an expert in freshwater mussel ecology, identification, and distribution. With over 10 years of experience looking at habitat needs, population performance, and thermal tolerance studies throughout the state. He's authored more than 47 peer-reviewed papers on mussels in Texas and has worked with numerous state and federal agencies and several river authorities in his research. He also assisted with the mussel species status assessment for the Texas hornshell recovery plan, which is under review. So his presentation today is freshwater mussels. What are they and why should I care? Thanks for spending time with us today, Dr. Ranclev.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing a few things that I think everybody's going to kind of want to learn about with mussels and again, why they're important and how they relate to kind of riparian management. All right, so the title of my presentation is, again, freshwater mussels. What are they and why should I care? And I think that's kind of really important. Mussels have played they're starting to play a significant role in how we do conservation and restoration for streams, but I'm always kind of amazed that people still don't really understand kind of what they are and why folks are starting to pay attention to them and how they're used or why they're used in stream restoration activities. So the question is, so what are they, right? So for those of you that don't know, freshwater mussels are bivalves. They basically evolved from a marine ancestor about 400 million years ago. So if you were to go to Dinosaur National Monument, in fact, I took my kids there this past summer, and you look at that giant slab of rock that contains all those fossilized dinosaurs from the Jurassic or Triassic period. What you'll notice if you're a giant mussel nerd like me is there's a bunch of clams that are also embedded within that matrix. And so we know that they again evolved sometime about 400 million years ago, invaded from probably a marine brackish system into freshwater systems and have since then radiated to where they now occupy just about every type of stream type within not only the United States, but globally. And so the mussels that we're often concerned with or focused on are those that occur in river or flowing type habitats. So that's going to be rivers and streams. Within those systems, they occur within really kind of a variety of what we refer to as mesohabitat types. They often occur basically along stream banks within kind of backwater protected areas. And so some of the conversations today when we were talking about riparian management and so forth, it is really important because it really determines and in some sense affects not only the quality, but also the persistence of that habitat that's within a stream, right? So if you begin to change the riparian zone, you begin to change the habitat in which these mussels reside in. They're pretty cryptic and conspicuous. So here are some really nice photos that were taken by a colleague of mine that works for Texas Parks and Wildlife, Clint Robertson. And what you see here is they pretty much occupy these interstitial spaces between cobble and gravel, or if this was in a sandy bottom stream, they would actually be fairly burrowed. And so it kind of takes a little practice to find them and locate them. I think what's also important and what these photos demonstrate is mussels are filter feeders. That's kind of the business that they're in within stream water ecosystems. And so they play a very important role in nutrient cycling. Depending on if they're fairly numerous within a stream, they can actually stabilize the stream bottom. And so I liken them to ecosystem engineers. They also are a food source for some animals, such as birds and fish. And then about 100 years ago, humans also used to consume them. So they do have a significant role in terms of ecosystem services. They also have a really unique reproductive life history. So unlike their marine cousins, freshwater mussels actually parasitize fish. And that's really interesting because from a conservation restoration perspective, not only do you need to worry about the habitat for juvenile and adult mussels, but you also need to worry about the habitat for fish. And again, so when we start thinking about riparian management, right, we're thinking about really two things. How do we effectively manage the riparian zone that will, again, affect the quality of habitat or protect the quality of habitat for mussels, but also their fish. And so here's kind of like an entire cycle from start to finish. And so you can see on the left, the larvae or Glaucidia are encysted on the gills. And then you can see they're very tiny after they develop into a juvenile mussel. And then it takes about 5 months for them to be honestly noticeable to a surveyor within a stream. And again, as I alluded to before, because mussels are filter feeders, they do play an important role in terms of ecosystem services. Again, they kind of link basically the water column to the benthos or the substrate. In addition to that, they also provide structural habitat for other organisms. So it's not uncommon to see aquatic insects and all sorts of other things residing on the exterior of the shell. And then again, depending on how numerous they are, they can actually modify and structure habitat, again, which is really important for other things that live within the benthos. And here's a classic like food web of kind of like a stream environment. And then you can hear I superimposed a mussel in the very far left-hand corner right over here. And the point is that mussels are part of, again, the web of life within these streams. And if we don't manage the landscape appropriately and they disappear, there are cascading effects that will affect other organisms within river systems. And so, the big question is, so this is kind of what they do. Now, why should I care? And this is really framed within the lens of conservation. And so, as I mentioned earlier, mussels are globally distributed. And so you would think for an organism or a group of organisms that are globally distributed, that they would perhaps be more secure than they are. And that's really not the case. But stepping back a little bit, the United States represents kind of like ground zero or the hotspot for mussel diversity. And what that means is the southeastern United States has the greatest number of species globally than anywhere in the world. And then Texas actually has the greatest number of species in anywhere in the world within the southwestern United States. So Texas is unique as always, but the United States is very unique when we're looking at global diversity for this group. And then if we want to start looking at like imperilment globally, what we see is freshwater mussels overall as a group tend to be the most imperiled. And that has a lot to do with how we manage our stream ecosystems. And again, a lot of that has to do again with riparian management. And there are a lot of reasons for mussel declines, but you can kind of look at them based off their life history. And it tends to be things that impact all life stages, whether it's the reproductive part or whether it's its host fish, or whether again it's larval or juvenile phase. And a lot of this again has to do with the fact that they're sessile, right? So these mussels live within the stream bottom, they don't move. And so as environmental conditions change, it's not like they can get up and swim away, right? They're kind of stuck and have to deal with those ambient conditions, which, if they're persistent over time, can lead to local extirpations and then eventually extinction. And so because mussels tend to be very sensitive to environmental change, as I was talking about earlier, they're being used by a number of natural resource agencies to kind of like be sentinels within the environment, right? So like, if mussels start to disappear, then that normally is a harbinger for other things to come. And so they're often used from a monitoring perspective, but they can also be used as a restoration from a restoration tool, right? So if we want to go in and begin to fix the landscape, mussels are a great way of testing whether or not those changes that are occurring, whether in the riparian zone or outside the riparian zone, or even from a flow management perspective, are having the intended effect that we hoped for. And in Texas, there's about 52 mussel species. So kind of like now kind of focusing on the state, 15 of those were listed as state threatened back in 2010. 11 of those are in some sort of like review with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for listing under the Endangered Species Act. One of them was listed in 2016, Texas hornshell, which is endemic to the Rio Grande. There's another species that ranges primarily within Oklahoma that is occasionally attributed to Texas. The Wichita Rock Pocketbook, but that occurs basically within the Red River drainage, so Northeast Texas. And so those are our two federally endangered species. And then Fish and Wildlife Service came out earlier this year and said that there were 6 species from Central Texas that will be listed at some point in time in the future. And so for those of you that are like, well, where do all these things occur? Most of our diversity is located within the eastern part of the state. And so when I say eastern part, what I'm referring to is the Trinity River drainage eastwards. And so that's where we have the most number of species. So the map on your right shows the number of species by river drainage. And so again, like the Trinity or the Sabine or the Natchez, you're talking about somewhere between 33 and 34 species. As you move from east to west, the number of species declines. But what's very interesting is the number of endemic species increases. So those would be mussels that are found nowhere else but Central or West Texas. And those also happen to be taxa that are being proposed for listing because they tend to be highly specialized or only occurring in one river system, or perhaps restricted to the upper or lower reaches of a river system. So there's just not very many of them in very many locations. And so, as I mentioned before, many of these endemics were proposed for listing, or at least reviewed for listing by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so here are some of the species status assessments. Won't go into detail on what those are, but just that those are that's the framework that the service uses to determine whether or not a species warrants some sort of federal protection. And much of the research that is either gone into those or is now starting to come out of those SSAs is kind of now starting to take place throughout the state, because at the beginning of this back in 2010, there were a lot of knowledge gaps. Those knowledge gaps have now been identified and are being addressed by both state and federal resource agencies. But at the same time, as we went through these species status assessments, we began to identify opportunities for restoration. And so a lot of the research that is ongoing is trying to basically address those two major topics. And a lot of those research activities can be kind of categorized into these four priorities. I just want to point out that a lot of the priorities initially were focused on understanding where they were, what species we had. So validating species, like trying to understand, are these real or are these not? And then as we begin to kind of take care of that basic information, it was starting to understand what defines their habitat, right? So understanding water quality and water quantity needs, with the idea that that could be used to inform restoration efforts. And a lot of the work that I do, again, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but a lot of the work that I do at A&M is focused on addressing kind of the latter, which is understanding kind of their habitat needs with the idea of informing both conservation and restoration practices. And a lot of that research utilizes landowner partnerships. Again, for a state that's primarily privately owned, that means that you have to have good landowner relationships, not only to access the rivers, but in order for any sort of restoration activity to have a true effect, you need landowner buy-in. And part of that landowner buy-in has been the topic of today's talks. Again, gets back to how do we properly manage not only our landscapes, but more specifically our riparian zones, because the riparian zones do play an important role in both the water quality and water quantity issues that we're talking about that affect freshwater mussels. And so with that pretty much wraps up, I think, what mussels are, why they're important, I think how they can play a role in conservation activities related to riparian management. And I'm happy to ask or answer any questions that folks may have if there's still time remaining. Thank you.
Appreciate that so much. Great presentation. Quick rundown on mussels. I know that was fast, everybody, and a lot of good information there. If you'd like to talk with Dr. Ranclev there, you can hit him up in the question and answer box. But otherwise, we would just like to thank everybody for attending today, and we would like to thank our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, Bear Crop Science, Native American Seed Company, Hoag Agri Partners, the Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas Brigades, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Again, thanks to our speakers, and especially to all of y'all for attending our 5th Plant Party webinar. Again, the Plant Party is a quarterly advanced plant webinar training series brought to you by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, PPWD, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and sponsored by the Renewable Resources Education Act. We'll be sending a link to a short survey by email, or you can type in the address to see what you see there on the screen and chat box. As a thank you for filling out our incredibly short survey at the end of the Plant Party, your phone number from the survey will be entered into a randomized drawing for an additional Plant Party cooler and 2 journal books. So there are 3 more chances to win simply by completing this survey. The next Plant Party will be on March 30th with the theme of breaking down plant identification. We'll send an email with more information to all the past registrants. You can see the survey link there in the chat window. Again, thank you for all attending. We hope you stick around if you have questions in the Q&A box. And again, thank you to all of our speakers. Y'all have a great day.